Hello everyone, I'm Diane, and today I'll be discussing morality. Morality can be a complex topic, but arises from surprisingly simple roots. But before we get to that, we need to understand what morality is, how it's defined, and how it's evaluated. Most of us seem to have an innate understanding of what being moral means, but have you ever stopped and tried to define it? By definition, morality deals with the principles of right and wrong, or good and bad behavior. If we say someone is behaving morally, we generally mean they are performing good acts, and if they are amoral, they are performing bad acts. Great, but what does being good and bad mean? Once you convert the idea of good and bad into pleasure and harm, we can start breaking down moral acts into basic biological instincts. So to be clear, a good act ends up increasing pleasure and decreasing harm, while a bad act decreases pleasure and increases harm. Of course, pleasure and harm are subjective, but generally, life is preferable to death, good health is preferable to illness, pleasure is preferable to pain, and so on and so forth. Before we can start evaluating things as morally good or bad, there is one other key point to recognize, and that's that humans are a social species that rely on each other for survival. Like many social species, we have developed some kind of rule set, some social order or behavior that is preferred in order to keep the peace and have the species prosper as a whole. This is not surprising since the goal of any species is to survive to the next generation. For species with complex social interactions, it makes sense to try to instill a rule set that will minimize hostility that comes from within the species. As a species, you wouldn't want your members to be constantly fighting and killing each other, since that would minimize the likeliness of surviving to another generation. This drive to survive is a biological one, and any patterns of behavior that benefit an individual or species stem from this survival instinct. Since humans can think about complex topics and try to understand the world around us, we decided to call this pattern of picking actions that benefit the species morality. Therefore, morality is just a complex survival instinct that has been instilled in all of us from previous generations. When it comes to evaluating actions as moral or amoral, it is important to understand how morality is rooted in species survival, since it helps explain why many acts that are self-sacrificing but benefit the group are labeled as moral, and many actions that are self-serving are labeled as amoral. It's all about survival of the group while minimizing hostility. Now that we have an idea of what morality is and where it comes from, let's take these concepts and evaluate a few examples. Murder. If you murder somebody, you are killing them unlawfully, or importantly, not in self-defense. You might get some pleasure from killing someone, but you cause the most harm you could to someone else since they don't exist anymore, and you harm the species by removing one of its members. The harm caused by a species losing one of its members is extremely hard to measure, since everyone has a different social circle size and contributes differently to the survival of the species, but it's a lot of harm. The overwhelming amount of harm that comes out of murdering somebody is why it's universally considered an amoral act. Stealing. If you steal, you're taking something for your own personal gain from someone else without their consent. When it comes to stealing, there are also two main categories or reasons why you would want to steal. You just want the item for personal gain, or you need the item for survival. If you steal an item only for personal gain, then you are depriving another individual or your community of resources they need and inflict more harm than the good you gain. Therefore, stealing for personal gain is considered amoral. If you are stealing for survival, it gets more complicated. Let's use stealing food as an example. If you steal food from someone who has a surplus, then more good is done if you steal the food, since you will survive and not do enough harm to the other individual to impact their survival. This is why people generally don't get upset or turn a blind eye if they see someone stealing food from a store during times of crisis like a natural disaster. However, if you steal from someone who only has a limited amount of food, things get even more complicated. Since in this scenario we don't know anything about you or the livelihood of the other individual, we have to consider all things equal, and you stealing food becomes neutral. Regardless if you steal or not, one member of the species is going to live, and one member is going to stop existing. If all things are equal, it all comes down to your personal preferences on if you should steal the food or not. Donating to charity. If you donate to charity, you give up some of your resources, in the form of money or otherwise, to help other members of the species for nothing in return. You feel good about what you've done and only lose a small amount of resources that causes a negligible amount of harm. Other people may be more likely to help you in the future since you've demonstrated that you can be selfless. You have helped other people and improved the well-being of the rest of the species. The amount of good that comes out of donating to charity, both for the individual and the species, is why it's seen as a moral act. So to recap, morality is the evaluation of if an action is good or bad. A good action increases pleasure, while a bad action increases harm. Actions need to be evaluated in the terms of how they impact multiple individuals, since humans are a social species, and the goal of a social species is to maintain peace and survive to the next generation. Hopefully you now have some idea of what morality is and can have a response to the question, where do morals come from? Thank you for watching. I'm Diane, and I hope you have fulfilling discussions.